This is Risky Women Radio, a show to connect, celebrate, and champion women in risk, regulation, and compliance. Sharing insight and perspective from the most influential members of our global Risky Women network on the latest developments we need to think about, the challenges we should all talk more about, and the innovation we are most excited about in governance, risk, and compliance. Bringing together the hundreds of senior women professionals already connected with a new emerging group of leading women and men. I'm Kimberley Cole, your Chief Risky Woman. Welcome to Risky Woman, Barbara Leach-Walters. Barbara is the founding and managing director of Berkshire Holdings Limited, an independent regulatory consultant. Barbara has over 20 years of experience in the financial services industry, most recently as Senior Vice President and Head of Compliance Asia Pacific for State Street. Based in Hong Kong, here with me, she previously held roles at GE Capital London, the UK Financial Services Authority and RBS in both London and Asia offices. She spanned financial risk, regulatory affairs, compliance, AML, conduct risk, ethics, and product advisory, and she's worked in banks, industry forums, and with regulators across Asia, UK, EMEA, and the US. So we have a lot to cover today. So welcome, Barbara.
Oh, thanks very much for inviting me here today. I'm delighted to be part of the Risky Women and looking forward to our conversation.
Fantastic. Let's start with your career, because everyone's always interested in people's career journeys. One of the things that I thought was really interesting was that you actually qualified with a Bachelor of Science in Engineering and went on now to span a whole range of different roles in compliance and risk. So tell us more about, from that qualification to where you are now.
Well, I mean, one of the things that I talk to younger people about is the fact that if you think you have a plan, forget it, because a lot of it doesn't end up being a plan. But what I would say that all the way going through is, there are core fundamental things that as an individual that are in your wheelhouse and are your key skills that you have. And certainly from an engineering perspective, what I learned and took away there was teamwork, the value of frameworks, being unafraid of technology, being used to the numbers, the value of data, complex structures. So those are things actually all the way through my career that I've had as interests. And yes, they did start in that area. I started in my first job after I graduated was in the oil industry in Calgary. And moved from there into finance and working and focusing on oil and gas analytics, and then from there progressed through many areas of finance. So I have done a lot of different things, and really what I hope to show as we talk today is actually the importance of from a risk perspective, having a lot of those experiences in a lot of different areas.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting in terms of, what skills we think that we need for the future. And I've heard some really interesting stories, even speaking with, academics at some of the institutions where we have big finance labs. They're talking about people who have creative and artistic skills, also then learning more about data and technology so that they can bring their creativity to visualization of tools and things like that. So I think it's very interesting, your perspective on what those skills, frameworks, technology, data and structures sort of gave to you. I mean, what more do you think in the future for sort of this, what do we need from a compliance skill set? What's that future going to look like?
Well, you're catching me at a great time there, because I've been to two events over the last week. One focused on fintech, one focused on regtech, really just to get up to date with what the conversations are. And it's a very exciting time period. What we are seeing here is the challenges that banks and financial institutions are seeing on the fintech side strategically, and how compliance and risk are going to need to react to that. And interestingly, we're also seeing reg tech, which is, at its most basic, just how to do the boring things more easily and much more quickly using AI or various big data and analytics techniques. So it's an exciting time out there right now.
Terrific. So I'm sure we're going to weave all over the place, but back more to a bit on your career, because you've worked across geographies, you've worked across several different industries, and as we said, in both financial institutions as well as with regulators and other areas. So can you tell me a bit about what have some of the biggest challenges been, and how have you sort of decided to cut a path through some of those challenges and make some decisions on your career?
Sure. I mean, just starting from the most basic, when I was working in investment banking early in my career. I'd put in my time supporting deals, doing a lot of late nights, ready for my next stage of formal education, and wanted some geographic exposure as well. So I made the decision to go to the UK to do my MBA at London Business School. That again, I always sit there and say it's not what you learn, it's actually who you're learning it with. And the exposure to the different nationalities, the group work, the different ways of thinking, living away from your native country was one of the most defining experiences, and certainly opened up a whole new world for me.
Fantastic. Now, you've worked across some very large institutions, from Royal Bank of Scotland, GE Capital, and most recently at State Street, where you had compliance oversight across the regional business lines, including global services, global markets, global operations, global exchange, investment management services, and the alternative investment solutions. So what were the key areas that were, I guess, top of the agenda, main focus areas in that role?
I mean, one of the big challenges in compliance these days is about managing your resource and making sure that you're focusing on the right issues, that you've got your base level framework and compliance policies in place. And as most of us though would say, the biggest thing that banks are focusing on these days is AML and financial crime, and ensuring that the policies, procedures, and monitoring and surveillance is appropriate to cover those risks.
Yeah, and I definitely want to come back to more on AML and financial crime. You are also Vice Chair of the Compliance Committee for ASIFMA, or the Asia Securities Industry and Financial Markets Association, since 2015. As an industry body, is it the same focus around AML and financial crime, or there are broader priorities that the industry bodies are looking at?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very topical question. I think ASIFMA is very supportive across a number of different subject areas. I think AML gets its own committee, to be fair, and certainly for the separate compliance committee, which is 25 approximately of the biggest financial institutions here based out of Hong Kong, what we see is a wide variety. It enables us as an industry group to work and establish relationships on a regular basis with HKMA and SFC, and to therefore then be able to influence and provide industry viewpoint to policy and development. That might be on outsourcing as a policy, what's required, what is covering the risk, what's not covering the risk, what do the banks think, are there particular issues that banks are having with respect to cost of interpretation, and really enabling that dialogue. I think as well what's exciting is that we're expanding it. What we're seeing is increased engagement from Singapore and a lot of interest there now in Singapore to be working more broadly across APAC. And I think that, it is an organization that started off as a small kernel before I even arrived in Hong Kong, as a lovely group of people who would get together for brown bag lunches to compare how and what people were working on, and to see it move and grow and develop into a formal industry force is just a fantastic accomplishment for that group.
I also think increasingly we kind of need more collaboration, more sharing. And if you look at some of the most recent figures around financial crime, like from the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crimes, in 2011, we're talking, it was estimated that 1% of illicit financial flows are seized and frozen by authorities. So I guess there's increasing focus on how we can address that. I mean, from your perspective, is enough being done to drive sort of collaboration across institutions, sharing information, sharing best practice, and especially in Asia where maybe some of the challenges are different or we need a different focus?
Yeah, I mean, I think the data and data sharing is a big challenge for a lot of organizations. Clearly, different countries have different requirements. They are not consistent. As we all know, working here, Asia is not one single country unit. It is not one single legal body. My old colleagues got so sick of me telling them that each country was different, because from an operational perspective, clearly that introduces cost. Yeah. And what we're all aiming for is to enable processes that don't overburden the consumer, don't overburden the corporates, but still enable straightforward engagement with law enforcement, with regulatory bodies, in order to reduce the financial crime. There's a very human face to this issue. It is related to drug trafficking. It is related to human trafficking and all sorts of other terrible things. Yes. So clearly, as a corporate social responsibility, this is very, very high priority for all of the organizations.
And given your recent interactions around fintech and regtech, was there any kind of interesting technology ideas that are coming out in that space to help us, fight the financial crime?
Oh, I was so excited. I mean, seriously, yes. If I had my ability, my checkbook out, there's some great development in that area. What we see is the ability to onboard clients and do all the checks that are required across multiple data streams. Various providers saying that they can do it in 3 minutes. Yeah. I mean, honestly, I've got a child that's heading off to university, and yesterday I spent a very long time, multiple hours, opening up a bank account. Which was highly amusing, given that the night before I was being promised I could do it in 3 minutes. So clearly there's a lot of scope for improvement there. Secondly, on the enforcement side, as we start to move into data sharing and understanding data, the fact that you can do transaction analysis using some of the big data techniques in a way that enables you to very easily see rootings and any misdemeanors that too is a huge development. And these sorts of things, if I take you back to the enforcements related to FX and LIBOR, those enforcements required organizations to submit terabytes of data. And certainly that's really where big data starts to make a difference.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's some really exciting and interesting things going on in the fintech and the regtech space that's going to really transform the way things are done. Some of what you mentioned as well, I think sort of takes us to this whole idea around accountability and conduct and ethics, especially FX, LIBOR, all of those scandals that came out. We had our regulatory summit in Singapore last week, and the senior bankers in Asia were sort of asked, what does conduct risk mean for their business operations? And all of the delegates certainly thought that management accountability was essential around improving conduct. There's been a lot of focus from the Asian regulators. They've placed more and more emphasis on the importance of conduct risk, but really still haven't provided a definitive explanation of what it means. And so some of the lack of clarity is meaning that banks in the region are forming their own views about conduct risk and how it should be defined in the context of their business organisations, and also coming up with their own governance procedures. So what's your perspective on how the industry is trying to define what it means, and how can we really build accountability around conduct?
Sure. Look, I think that I will caveat that by saying that most of the regulators around the world will say this is additional fill-in guidance. We've always expected good conduct. We've always had expectations for how this is to be delivered. And when I'm doing training, I often sit there and say, well, you all know what bad conduct is. So it's almost easier to define it in the reverse than in the positive. But what banks and financial institutions are struggling with is metrics and measurement, as opposed to implementation of good conduct. So it's the space of decisioning. How do I evidence? What am I looking to evidence? And is that evidence box ticking, or is it really effective evidence? So that's definitely where the challenge is. In the overall development, though, of culture and conduct, it is simply further developments from the impacts of the financial crisis. When people went in, and were doing the follow-ups on the various enforcement cases, the things that they came across when they started listening to every tape and reading every email really were eye-opening to people. And so therefore reinforce the need to verify as opposed to trust. And that was definitely the big change. But if I think back to the early days when I was working in the regulator and with the Bank of England, I don't think that this would be any different from expectations at that time.
Yeah, it's very interesting. So generally, do you think there's sort of best practice areas from who owns the conduct risk policy, who's accountable for implementing it, where the leadership is taking this? I mean, what are the things there that you're saying of who's doing it well, so to speak?
Sure, and I think that your Thomson Reuters analysis was very interesting on that case. I mean, when you look at an analysis that has a broad spread of people who own conduct risk, well, it's really owned by everybody. That should be the easy answer, and yet there's a lot of different views that the board owns it, or frankly, even compliance owns it. But I do come across that, like, just because it's a regulation doesn't mean that compliance owns it. And if compliance ran at the bank, in my rules, I would have been paid a lot more. So clearly there's a broad ownership needed for that, and a broad recognition of that is the case. And a lot of the banks and financial institutions have been working on, enablement policies to make that clear, better engagement with their staff, starting to change remuneration systems to have a risk score within it, an accountability score within it, so that people recognize the importance.
Yeah, it's interesting because at the summit in Singapore, 36% of participants said that poor leadership and lack of accountability led to bad conduct outcomes. 31% indicated that a strong emphasis on incentives drove the wrong kind of behaviour, leading to poor customer outcomes. And this suggests that executive accountability is a decisive factor in ensuring proper conduct and better outcomes for consumers as well. So, let's talk a bit more about what's the link between accountability and risk. Because certainly we've seen some, pretty bad outcomes for business, whether it's just reputational risk or, in many cases, fines.
Sure. So I think that the expectations of, the regulatory system, policy and framework is always that, the accountability is there. The focus on hard coding that right now is because actually the outcome was that the regulators, when it came to enforcement, actually weren't able to get that accountability to land in the place that they believed the accountability should land. I think that we have seen a variety of different types of models of accountability there. You have obviously the SMR regime that started off the hard coding of that within the UK. You've had the implementation here in the SFC of a manager in charge regime, a bit more right-sized. You see the BEAR consultations taking place and implementation starting in Australia as well, and obviously in Singapore. HKMA has had this regime for some time. And they are reminding institutions about that. So it's very topical, and I think it ties in very nicely with the parallel focus on governance and how your organization works, who owns what, clean handoffs, clear accountability, and I think that it's really just about housekeeping in some ways, because this should be there already. But the additional policy and implementation of it just makes it more clear. Now, the immediate reaction of the first line profit owners, is, I have so much to do on this, I don't have time to do my job. And there is concern there. There's concern about the actual accountability, the liability, the director's liability. But clearly, if you're doing your job, if you're delivering what you should be delivering to the best of your abilities, there should be nothing to worry about.
Yeah, I mean it's interesting as well because the fines are always brought up as well. So the statistics are that since the 2009 financial crisis, financial institutions have paid regulators fines reaching 345 billion according to BCG, and that's only up until the end of 2017. And this is fines that have been meted out for money laundering, rate manipulation, mis-selling products, negligent financial advice, failure of managed funds, resulting in investor losses, overcharging fees, and obviously we're seeing a lot of these things brought up during the Royal Commission in Australia at the moment, which you've got to think of, far more widespread than maybe what we're seeing. And then executives at organisations, in many cases have really not been seen to be held accountable. Most of them have kept their jobs or received golden handshakes. I mean, recently we've seen boards, step down in Australia, for example. But, are the fines effective, or are we still effectively just rewarding what is often pretty unethical behaviour?
I'm quite conscious that I'm sitting here in Thomson Reuters right now, given that I'm about to sit there and say, but the press doesn't know everything. So there are lots of penalties that have been handed out that do not reach the public arena. There are careers that get impacted. There are decisions that are made about viability of a person leading a particular organization, or whether and how their further work in the financial industry will be supported or not. There is sharing between countries in terms of references related to outcomes of internal investigations. So there is definitely a broader range than the formal press release announcements that do make it out. Look, it's that balance though, and for some of the fines, you could say that certain countries just have an unbelievable ability to fine, and other countries don't, and yet it's the same egregious behavior. So there is not always a common metric there to actually be looking at. What we do definitely want to see though and support is proper functioning markets, and that the consumer and the corporates are being treated fairly as customers, and that's just good business, period.
Great. So I fear that we're running out of time, so what I'd like to move on to now is our Risky Women rants and revelations. So we'd like to start with, what's one piece of advice that you would give to your younger self?
I think the thing that I would always sit there and say is keep aiming high. As I learn more and more and get more senior, I am always struck that women need to be more positive and confident about their abilities. They have to go for it, even if they don't have all of the things covered on the requirements, because people can do it and they can deliver it. And I spend a lot of time, coaching and mentoring staff, and I tell you, there's nothing better than actually convincing somebody to understand that they can do something.
Absolutely, I agree. Confidence, and I think sort of surrounding yourself by cheerleaders who can also tell you that you can do it is really helpful. And then, what's your rant? What's the one thing that you really wish you could change now, and why?
I think My rant would be, compliance is really interesting, and it's not a bad thing, and yet there's so I hate to tell you like how many like cocktail party jokes there are about compliance. So yes, that would be my rant.
Well, you're probably preaching to the choir of the people listening to this, so very good. Okay, so our rapid fire round. Punchy answers to killer questions. What one word sums up the world of governance, risk and compliance from your perspective?
Technology.
What's your top risk for 2018?
Accountability.
And the cure for the cost of compliance?
Oh, RegTech, FinTech.
Biggest technology impact on compliance and risk?
Client onboarding.
And your outlook for the year ahead? Optimistic, pessimistic, uncertain?
Optimistic.
Thank you very much, Barbara, for being our risky woman today. It was fabulous to gain a few insights from you, and we look forward to seeing you at our next events.
Thanks very much for Thomson Reuters and the invitation. Absolutely delighted.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to this exciting episode of Risky Women Radio to connect, champion and celebrate women in risk regulation and compliance. I'm Kimberley Cole, based in Hong Kong. For more information on the Risky Women Global Network, head to our website in the episode notes, and please be part of the ongoing conversation by subscribing to this podcast, connecting with us on Twitter, or even reaching out to me directly by email.